Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Amplify Your Business. Today, I am talking about the legal profession and the entrepreneurial journey in creating a startup in that space. And with me today is Grant Lahring. Grant is the co-founder and head of growth over at Goodlawyer, a firm down in Calgary. Actually, Grant, would you call yourselves a firm, or because you guys are kind of beyond that? It's not your
I think we're
typical
legally
firm.
not allowed to call ourselves a firm.
Oh, yeah.
We're a software company, a marketplace, if you will, that provides startup founders and other founders with specialized legal services at a price they can trust. And we do that through a marketplace software, which basically cuts out the firm. So our tool lets you work directly with lawyers rather than communicating with the firm and paying all that extra overhead for no reason.
Awesome. Well, we're going to get into that in a little bit more, but the first question I want to ask you is, what are three things that you think every entrepreneur needs to know?
Sure. I guess I'll start with, there's a lot we could go into here, but one would be if you want to go far, get a group together. I talk to startup entrepreneurs every single day. 3 or 4 of them. That's kind of part of my MO as the head of growth at Goodlawyer, and we serve founders. So I talk to a lot of founders. By far, the biggest signal to me that a company is going to be successful is if they've managed to convince other people to join them on that journey. In the initial stages, that's really hard. But if you can't talk even one person into becoming your CTO or becoming your COO, you're never going to convince someone to buy your product. And
Good point.
That's where I would always start with finding some co-founders and convincing them that what you're doing isn't insane. They'll keep you propped up when things get really hard. And the fact is that one person can only do so much. You're limiting the scope of your business if you try to do it on your own. I'm going to go into the legal stuff of it because that's why we're here. But I see a lot of people with kind of mangled legal experiences, and I feel really bad about that. That's kind of what we're out there to solve. But I would say legal doesn't have to be a scary thing. It generally opens doors for founders. So when you start up, you generally have to pick some kind of legal structure to build your business around. Usually a corporation. That is a tool. Once you've got that corporation, you can use things like share options. You can attract investment. You can actually operate without taking personal risk. That's a hugely powerful tool, but a lot of entrepreneurs hesitate to incorporate because they're scared of talking to a lawyer and they're scared of messing it up. So I would say go for it. And then that continues on further down the road. It opens doors to things like closing big deals, operating internationally, licensing your IP, these powerful methods of making extra cash. So don't be afraid of legal. That's what I would say. Third is every journey is your own. I think when I started with Goodlawyer, and to this day, I'm given advice by about 9 million people every single second, from podcasts, from TV shows, from walking down the street. Everyone's got advice for you. They're all smart people, but they don't know what you know. And I think entrepreneurs should trust themselves a little bit more than they do, and be a little more confident with what they understand and know about their industry, because generally an entrepreneur becomes very, very skilled in their area of business. And this helps keep them anchored and stay focused and avoid spending a bunch of time zigzagging when strategically they should be going in a straight line if they can. That's always the fastest way to get from point A to point B.
Yeah. I really love that last point that you made around, the zigzagging that we have, which is born out of sometimes insecurity around or not having the conviction to really, put our foot down and plan ourselves on, no, we are going in the right direction. I have faith in this, I have faith in me, and I understand this market. And so you're right. There's so many things that we hear that are competing advice that really sometimes leaves us paralyzed a little bit. And it's like, sometimes you just have to, block some of that out. I mean, listen to it, take the things that are going to be valuable, and then make it your own, right? Yeah.
Totally. And some of it's just like flat out bad advice too. I mean, like there's advice out there that I see people misappropriate. And
yeah,
the one I'm going to hit on is the one that is maybe hit on frequently in other spaces, but move fast and break things is often quoted in startups as like an idea that it's all about like hitting fast, learning, and kind of getting through it, which maybe it is. But I would say that moving slower and getting things right is obviously less expensive. Like, just think about it. What happens if you break something? That something might be a relationship with a client. That something might be,
Mhm.
a payment moving through your platform, or a data breach that could cost you your whole business. Like, breaking things is a very bad thing for companies. You should not be trying to break things.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think yeah, try things and pivot fast, right? If it's not working, is maybe where a lot of that. I think where the origin of that really was, right? I think, I don't know, but I like that as well. I also really like what you were saying, just with regard to getting that group together and convincing it. If you can't convince the first person that what you're doing isn't insane, then it's going to be difficult to sell your product. And so I love that line. That's a really great line, because isn't that the truth? I mean, there's so many people that I've talked to who have great ideas, they're just brilliant people, or they think they have a great idea, and they're brilliant people, and they are just so tunnel vision sometimes, where they don't see the cracks in what they have or what they're trying to build, and they can't convince somebody else to come on and join them. Yeah, they're never going to be able to sell that. So you're right. And speaking of that, I mean, you came on not at the very beginning, so you were sharing with me that the company was founded first. You came in real early as a co-founder, and that was one of the things that you did, is you were seeing or observing some of the things that they weren't doing quite right, and obviously you had faith in the idea. You didn't think they were insane, and so you jumped on board, invested your own time and energy into now trying to grow this company into something much bigger, as you have done over the last 3 years. But before we get into your backstory, why don't you share with us a little bit more about Goodlawyer? So what problem is it that you're trying to solve for entrepreneurs, small business people right now?
Totally. So the original guy who came up with the idea was Brett Colvin, our CEO and co-founder, along with his former co-founder, Steve Bodie, who were lawyers at a big firm in Canada. They were very young guys doing huge files for entrepreneurs, and they were billing out at kind of $300 to $500 an hour at BLG. And the founders couldn't afford it. It was just a terrible legal experience. Like, they tracked their time in 6-minute increments. They knew they weren't even really the best people for the files they were doing. Like, they need senior expertise, and you've got someone with like a couple years experience on it. Gradually they moved up at the firm and got skilled, I'm sure, those things. But the truth is that sometimes founder files are really small for those big firms. Those files get sent to students and early stage associates who do all the work. So even though you're paying an extreme premium to work with the largest firm in Canada, you're getting work from someone who's relatively new to the whole thing. It just didn't feel right to them.
Yep.
Now, Goodlawyer is basically the anti that. So we've made a software that lets you work directly with the lawyer, cuts out all the overhead and things. So another piece of that story was that when Brett's billing out at $500 an hour, he's keeping about 70. That seems pretty messed up, because where's the rest of that going? Like, one person's doing the work for one person, and the rest of it's just vanishing into overhead. So that was the problem they wanted to solve. And the solution is basically a marketplace model. So you can go straight to the lawyer, cut out the overhead. And now we're finding that there's a lot of other things we can build into that model that make the legal experience better. Things like transparency around pricing, like knowing your price before you start. Things like knowing your deadlines, like when you're going to get it. Things like being able to talk to your lawyer whenever you want, not whenever they want. Lots of things that really elevate the legal experience for founders.
Yeah, and when I was on your website, what I really loved was that you have bundles as well. So you have these fixed price bundles. So we have cost certainty as a startup or as a small business person. It's which is really nice to see, because sometimes, like, once you start, that file gets open and you start working with it, before you know it, before anything is actually accomplished, you're thousands and thousands of dollars potentially into it on the billable side of things, and it's just the clock is just rolling forward. In this case, if I need something, I know exactly what that cost is going to be, which I love that model.
Yeah, totally. Like, so many companies need like a standard service agreement. Like, it can't be like a template online, because that wouldn't apply to their business directly. But it doesn't have to be like a Cadillac of agreements that's going to work for like $1 million deals internationally. So you can go to Goodlawyer and get like a standard agreement customized for your business for a flat price. That's something we do lots of. We also do a lot of the bigger stuff, like but those flat prices are pretty integral to the model. Those are things that we believe are like a standard amount of value delivered at a standard price.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really cool that you guys have come in and disrupted this whole industry, really. So from a competitive standpoint, do you have many competitors out there that have a similar kind of model, or are you guys pretty unique?
There's a few, but they're a lot smaller than us at this point. Certainly we're the biggest in Canada. It's not a model that is legal in the States fully, which is why it doesn't exist there. There are some companies kind of dabbling around it in Australia, the UK, France even, and some elements in the States, but limited, really, really limited, because it's seen as fee splitting in a lot of places, which means like it could potentially compromise like the quality of the work, but also the integrity of the work. So anyway, what I would say is Canada is basically pretty advanced on legal innovation, and that's why it has to be built here first. From here, we can go into all these places, and as the regulations are opening up, we're pretty confident that we'll be able to be global at the end of the day, because the business of law, which is what we do, is basically exactly the same anywhere on earth.
Yeah. The essence is the same, right? There's nuances, but the essence of it is pretty much the same. Yeah. So now back to your story then. So tell me how you got involved with these guys, how you had that first conversation where you decided these guys weren't insane. They do have a business model, and why did you yourself want to get involved?
Totally. So I've worked in startups for most of my career. So I kind of knew what that was like. And I was at an event, I ran into the team, and they were running around with business cards trying to sell people at this event on their idea. And I didn't think that was very efficient. So I talked to one of the co-founders who I knew from a previous startup I had with my brother. But we hadn't really talked in a couple of years, and I kind of explained like what I would do. And they liked it. They're like, okay, let's try it. I had like, I guess it was like a frantic phone interview type thing. And then I eventually went and met the team in person, like, this is what we're gonna do. And it was right in COVID, when COVID was breaking out, so like we couldn't really even like be in the same room. So one thing led to another. I was consulting for them for a month before my bills got too expensive for the company. In that month, I did dip my toes into it, because I knew I kind of wanted to see if this could be a full-on thing. So one of the things I did in my engagement was I called every customer we had to see how things were going for them and see if they liked using the platform. And they loved it. And this was the big thing for me, is like, once the customers were telling me like, yeah, this is amazing, like I can't believe this didn't exist before, I knew that the company was going somewhere. And then I was getting early traction on like the work I was doing. I was like, okay, we could sell things, people love it. Like, the model to me intuitively makes sense, but there's some evidence to back up that this is going places. So that's kind of when I decided I would jump in.
And so then you jump in, you take some equity then instead of pay completely. I'd imagine it's some sort of blend, is it?
Yeah, sad, but equity's good.
And so then you're now on the ownership team, and you're really trying to grow this thing. And so it sounds like you've had a lot of success in the 3 years that you guys have been around. Now, in terms of your journey then through that, can you share with us a little bit about what it's like coming in as a co-founder, but not in the original founding group?
Totally. So maybe one of the dirty secrets of startups is that the co-founding is super tough, and co-founders often leave. Like I mentioned Steve before, like one of the original co-founders left. He didn't want to work in a startup anymore. He wanted to go back to law. That was an expensive and difficult breakup all around, because he had a lot of equity. So that was one. I came in after that. And I was to some extent kind of outside the group. Like I didn't know really anybody on the co-founding team. All of the other three at that time knew each other from like high school or through family or whatever. So I did feel a little bit on the outside of that. But what was special about it was I had a skill set that fit in right where they needed it. Like we had a lawyer, a CEO, and a visionary leader, and that's Brett. And he's really, really good at all those things. We had a CTO who's a very capable, flexible developer who can understand architecture and all those things. And we had a CPO, like a chief product officer, who could design and basically enable the CTO to work faster and more efficiently. But we had no one on growth or sales or anything like that. So there was like a huge gap that I like just slipped right into. So that part made it a lot easier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so one of the things that I would think might be an advantage for you is that you're not a lawyer. Correct me if I'm wrong, because I think one of the challenges that lawyers have is they see the risk always, right? They see where things could go wrong. And so from somebody who's on the business development side, trying to sell the product, sell the service, you really have to focus on, all the things that are going to go right. And you have to approach it from a slightly different perspective. And obviously every business needs to manage its risk well. But I mean, that's one of the challenges that, some of the startup entrepreneurs that I've talked to who have, they've always called themselves recovering lawyers. They have the legal background. That's one of the things that they always say that they struggle with the most is actually taking the risk and stepping out a little bit of their comfort zone. So is that something that you and the rest of the partners who aren't lawyers, do you really balance that part of it out, or does the CEO have a real knack for being able to balance that himself?
I mean, no, we have a risk tolerant CEO, that's for sure. He's all in. I think he kind of understands how this works. Like it is all in. Like it's the consequences of failure are the company disappearing, which is high, but also like no one's going to jail for it. So we've already kind of lived at the max from the beginning, and like failing to move and failing to act has the same consequence as making a mistake. So we're actually fairly risk tolerant, I would say. I do think your point on lawyers is really good, though. I think like lawyers can broadly be defined as like deal makers and deal breakers. And this is a thing they do, not me. Deal makers are the people who look for managing just enough risk to get the job done. Deal breakers are the people who will try to find any kind of loophole and close it. Those can kill deals because they extend them, the period for like 3-6 months. We work with entrepreneurs. We tend to work with deal maker lawyers because of the exact reason. It's like at the end of the day, we're trying to close this client or whatever. It's not necessarily about like reducing the risk on this contract to zero isn't going to help our company. Closing the deal at the minimum acceptable risk is. So that's my stance on that.
Yeah. So now one of the things that we talked about before we hit the record button is just conflict in partnerships and organizations and startups in particular, as you're, growing fast and trying not to break things like you mentioned. And so there's a lot of different personalities around the table, different ideas around the table, and sometimes conflict is just inevitable. You have to address it. Some entrepreneurs, some people, some managers, they'll try to avoid that at all cost. You guys have a different approach on that, it sounds like.
Yeah, I'd say I think academics will broadly define conflict in 3 ways. Like it's either task conflict, like conflict around working activities, how to do the job, process conflict, which is kind of like the weird one that no one really talks about. It's more conflict around how do we do the thing. Task conflict is more about doing the thing, and then interpersonal conflict, which is like you're a jerk. Goodlawyer is characterized by high levels of task conflict. We argue about what to do because we are all in the same boat. Like we've got sophisticated legal acumen on the team. Therefore, we make liberal use of those share tools, which are available to startups who have rapidly growing valuations, to compensate people. And as a result, we're all owners to some degree. And owners have a motive not just to appease their boss, but to help the company succeed. And that means that if they get the feeling that their boss is driving the company off a cliff, there's a conversation and it's going to be passionate. So there's certainly been some raised voices in the office over the last couple of years, and I will not pretend otherwise.
Yeah. Well, and it's fine. It's totally good. And this is one of the things that a lot of people are, so nervous about. But conflict is good, because at the end of that, oftentimes you end up in a much better place than what you had at the beginning. Like you said, if somebody's taking the company or making decisions that you don't necessarily agree with, but you're both trying to drive the business in the same direction, as long as you're aligned in that overall direction, then the conflict is going to make it so that you can get there in the best way possible. Probably you enhance the odds of success. So one of the things that that I'm also curious about, because you've talked to a lot of founders, because that's what you said, like you're out there having these conversations all the time with founders. Are you finding in your conversations with them any common threads there in terms of the skill sets that they bring to the table that differentiate the ones who seem to be successful from the ones who seem to be struggling more?
Yeah, I mean, not only do I talk to a lot of founders, I also study them. So my undergrad and my MBA both specialize in entrepreneurship.
Oh,
Um,
awesome.
what I see is generalists, like startup founders, generally generalists, entrepreneurs are generally generalists, with expertise in an industry. So knowing that industry inside and out, and then being able to perform different functions in it, without like worshiping one thing. And this is really hard if you go like, say you ran an SEO company and you want to start a startup, you're going to use SEO to market that startup. Like that's your weapon of choice. You're going to go straight in for it. But if that turns out to be not the right tool, the founder's going to have to find other tools. So I certainly see a lot of generalists. The other thing I see, and this is more from academia, founders are very diverse. Like the way they approach it is very, very different across the board. I've seen people who've bootstrapped from nothing. I've seen people who've raised a fantastic amount of capital with absolutely zero traction.
Yeah.
And I've seen everything in between. I would say the common thread is that entrepreneurs tend to be resilient. The amount of stress you get put under is absurd sometimes, and to bow out is always an option. Like you can always quit and go back to whatever job you did before you started your company, and settle down and do that for the rest of your life. But the successful entrepreneurs push through that stubbornly and deal with it, which is very impressive. I have a huge respect for all entrepreneurs in Canada and around the world.
Yeah. So I'm curious, because you've studied entrepreneurs, you are an entrepreneur. So this is a very unique, opportunity for me to talk to somebody who has all this knowledge. So from the personal perspective, yourself, I'm really interested to know what you think is one of the biggest challenges that or maybe also from what you're hearing, what you're, experience with other entrepreneurs. What's the biggest challenge to the entrepreneurial life?
Yeah, so all the hard questions here. There's so many different challenges. What's the biggest one? I feel like, maybe that's part of the point, is that there are many different challenges. And I think being an entrepreneur means, as I said, being a generalist and resilient, it means being able to solve a lot of different problems. But I would say dealing with stress is probably the big one. Like it creeps into every part of your life. And I've seen in startups I've worked with, I've seen relationships fall apart. I've seen people gain tons of weight, kind of become shadows of their former selves over the years. And never mind like the money, like there's things about living a good life. And one of them is certainly health. I've seen health decline rapidly in founders. So being able to deal with that stress is critical.
So I throw it back at you then, in that sense, like what is it that you do to maintain your health, whether it's mental or physical, so that you can come and show up, your best self every day?
It's a good question. And this is personal, so I'm glad you asked it, but my approach is that like, I need to be on the top of my game so I can make good decisions, because my decisions have consequences for other people, not just myself. So I really try to stay on top of my own health. I balance it with simple, like, kind of body, mind, soul technique, like watch my physical health. I gotta make sure I'm exercising. I eat as well as I can. And sleep, those basic pillars of those things. I also really try to avoid heavy drinking or drugs, anything like that. I know that can be a common kind of out for founders, and I know sometimes you get pushed into that, you kind of have to, but they generally mess with your brain, and I find that they stress me out more than they help. So
Yeah.
try to avoid all that. Socially, like having good friends and healthy relationships is critical. And I think communicating a lot with your partner helps. Like my partner certainly is like a counselor to me sometimes. And even just being able to talk to her about challenges I'm facing at work, even though she is completely outside her world, she can be very sympathetic, and I feel like completely relieved and absolved when I've had a chat with her.
Yeah.
So those are some things. I think what was the last one? Mentally, I think just like mental focus, I think, comes from the physical focus. Like if you can stay healthy, you can stay clear, and just knowing your limits and when you are going to hit them, and trying to avoid making critical decisions when you're at a mental low. Some of those things should just be slept on.
Yeah, I think you just delivered a whole pile of nuggets of information there. And so like that last one is so true, right? It's kind of like the advice that you're given is to, when you're writing a letter, responding to somebody, and you're in the wrong state of mind, maybe just wait to send it in the morning and reread it. And if you ever do that, you end up rewriting the whole damn thing, because it's like, yeah, no, time is good in those circumstances. Get in a different frame of mind. But the one thing that you said that I wrote down that I really liked too was the fact that the consequences of your decisions impact so many others when you're the founder of a company, when you're in a senior leadership position of a company. And that's something that we shouldn't take lightly. And so I really like the fact that you mentioned that, because it is such an easy thing to forget, because we oftentimes internalize everything ourselves, and so it's about us, it's the stress that we're taking on and everything else, and the impact it has on our own personal lives, but it really has a ripple effect across everybody else who's reporting to you, or in the case when you're leading a company, everybody else is in that company. So I really like that one, so thanks for sharing that. A question for you, because of the academic approach that you've had to learning about entrepreneurship, and now then what you're doing right now. And I suspect you probably have continued to be quite a reader or consumer anyway of business content. And so do you have a favorite book? Do you have a favorite podcaster, blogger, somebody that you really admire and you look forward to reading their content or absorbing their content? Is there anything that jumps out at you that we might be able to share here with our audience?
Yeah, I was worried you'd ask that. I'm gonna take it down left field. I generally avoid like pop media and stuff like that. I think I find the rigor is just very low, even in books that appear really well researched. And I'll take a stab at a specific one so that I can illustrate this point, but like Good to Great is considered one of the top business books by most people.
Yeah.
The methodology is inherently flawed. They took a group of successful companies and then they found unsuccessful companies to compare them with, and they said this is why they're successful. But they could not apply that in a predictive way. It was applied retroactively. So the whole like pseudo-scientific basis to the book is flawed. I'm not saying it's not right, but I'm definitely not saying it is right. The science doesn't conclude anything from that. Most of the research that is being done is a lot more cautious around prescribing these things, and I find that piece, like, one, I think that the methodology behind most like what I call pop business books is flawed. I think people are looking for an easy out and they find it in those books. And two, the situations are so different. Like you look at the author and they're like, this guy built a construction company in Calgary in the 80s. It's like, well, obviously he's rich. Like there was a boom here. We built like half the city in the 80s. You could be like a meth head on the corner of the street shoveling concrete and make pretty good money. Like it's different situation. You're trying to build like a software company on the same principles, you're going to run into trouble. Even if the advice was spot on. So
yeah, Yeah, no, and I think that's really good. I like the where you're taking that critical approach where it's like think about what you're reading a little bit more and really try to discern the basis of what they're trying to communicate or the formula that they're trying to create. Because that's the thing with so many of the business books, right? It's all everybody's trying to preach some new formula to it, and it's sometimes it just like I think earlier you were talking about it, and I definitely have had other guests on this show talk about just how unique entrepreneurs are and the challenges that we all face, and we can't apply the same advice across the board because the problems, the personalities, the industries, and then the time frame is so different. So yeah, I think that's good advice. If you were to write yourself a letter that you could send back to your younger self 3 years ago, what would be in that letter?
I mean, probably get into really specific stuff because I think about this all the time. But first and foremost, so we're building a marketplace company with supply and demand on it. Those two sides have to be balanced to create a good experience. You want enough lawyers, enough clients. And we rely heavily on referrals. So like 40% of our customers are coming in from referrals from other users, which is another one of the benefits of a marketplace model. These tend to have really good virality. We started out serving all of Canada, and we have been kind of forced to stick with that. It would have been way simpler to serve one jurisdiction at a time. I mean, we've got a lot more hype. And the example here is like, for us to acquire a client in Alberta, very easy. Our reputation is quite good here. There's a pretty good chance they've heard of us from multiple sources or even met one of the team members. When I was in a meeting with a guy in Halifax today. He has never heard of us. Obviously, he has no idea what's going on. It's way harder to pitch him. In fact, even getting him onto that meeting was really difficult. So
Yeah.
If I was to go back to point number one, I would limit the scope as much as possible and get like a nice dense network going instead of going broad, because it's really hard to put the genie back in the bottle.
So
the other one, I think, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think that's bang on. Like that the challenge that you guys have in building both sides of the market at the same time. We've had other entrepreneurs on here with a similar challenge where they're doing both sides of it. It is so difficult, and for you guys to be able to succeed in that broader market right across Canada the way that you have to date is just kudos to you guys and to the product that you have. Obviously, it's something that is resonating as far as a need with people. So anyway, I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead. What's the second thing that you have in that letter?
Yeah, we're brute forcing, and it's working, but it is a lot harder than it would have been. And yeah. So point number two I'd probably leave is cash is king. So like I really think this can't be emphasized enough. And I think a lot of entrepreneurs are way ahead of me in my mentality on this, but the startup ethos for a long time was all about growth. It was like grow as fast as possible. You'll get a bunch of funding. You'll get really big. Which when you get into it, you realize is kind of like a weird Ponzi scheme where like the startups kind of get this venture capital just so they can make it to the next milestone, so that those same investors can cash out and like leave, and the next ones can kind of like try to get you to the next one so they can cash out. And it's never really about, you know, the business getting all the way to being profitable or anything like that. It's just about growing rapidly between those milestones so they can cash out at a higher valuation.
Yeah.
Building healthy cash numbers really makes a lot of that stuff easier. Like you don't have to worry about getting so much venture capital. It's easier to attract the capital. And things like burn rate and stuff like that just kind of come naturally if you're already focused on cash and not like top line growth. So I would say like, healthy cash is inside of a healthy business.
I was going to ask, have you guys been able to self-fund this, or has it been something where you've brought in outside investors, friends and family rounds, anything like that?
We've raised a few rounds, and full credit to Brett and his work there. He's an incredible fundraiser and he tells the story brilliantly. And we've been fortunate enough to raise a bunch of capital, but a lot of other companies do not have that option. So it's harder than you think to raise a round.
Yeah, for sure. Lots of nuances there. Well, I got to tell you, Grant, I really appreciate the fact that you came onto the show and shared with us your experiences, both as an entrepreneur, as a, co-founder that came in a little bit after. I think that's a new take, or a different take than what a lot of the people are that I'm talking to. And so it's a different experience. And so there's a lot of things that you learn there, a lot of things that you're able to share. Loved some of the comments that you've made. Definitely the one that I just keep going back to is just that having to convince somebody else that that you're not insane, your product is that our service is not insane. And so gather that group around you that you can convince that first, so you know that you actually have a product. That's the first time I've ever heard that, right? Because usually it's about, well, go out and try to sell it to somebody. You're talking about selling it to who could be a co-founder. So that's a really great piece of advice. So thank you very much, Grant. I really appreciate it. If people wanted to connect with you, wanted to learn more about Goodlawyer, what's the best way to do so?
Oh yeah, I mean, they can always connect with me on LinkedIn. It's LinkedIn/Grant Lahring. But you can also email me. It's grant@goodlawyer.ca. Always happy to have a chat with a founder. That's kind of my rule. My calendar is yours. If you want to chat about anything, whether it's legal, obviously, love to see if we can help you out. But if it's growth or like your own experience, I'd love to hear that too. And always open for a chat with a founder.
Yeah, sounds great. And we're going to chat a little bit more right after I wrap this up. So for anybody who really enjoyed this episode and want to check out the archives, head over to amplifyyourbusiness.ca. That's where you're going to find us. And also, if you prefer listening to this on an audio only format, then just search for Amplify Your Business on your favorite podcasting platform and you'll find us. Until next time, everybody have a prosperous day. And thanks again, Grant. I really appreciate the time.